Welcome back, guys, to Captain Rebel. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit that subscribe. In November 2004, I was part of the coalition forces stationed in Afghanistan, operating deep within the rugged spine of the Hindu Kush Mountains, a place where sunlight fades fast and legends never die. What started as a simple mission under Operation Enduring Freedom turned into something none of us were trained for. The kind of story that doesn't fit neatly into any after-action report. The Hindu Kush has stood for thousands of years, watching empires rise and vanish beneath its shadow. Long before we set up base at Bagram Airfield, monks carved their temples into its cliffs, Persians told tales of demons that lived beneath its peaks, and soldiers, from Alexander to the Soviets, vanished into its caves, never to return. But in 2004, one of those caves called to us again, and this time, we answered. What follows is my account, not rumor, not secondhand report, my own mission log, exactly as it happened. I can't tell you what we found that day was human. I can only tell you it was real. By the time November 2004 rolled around, I'd already been in Afghanistan for 7 months. The days had started blending together, dust, noise, static-filled radios, and that constant hum of engines that never quite let you rest. I was a staff sergeant then, leading a small reconnaissance team attached to the 10th Mountain Division. Most of our operations were standard cache sweeps. Go in, find old Soviet stockpiles, log, destroy, and move on. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept people alive. When the orders came down for another cave investigation northeast of Bagram, it sounded routine. The coordinates pointed to a ridgeline maybe 12 kilometers out, an area that hadn't seen recent contact but showed signs of old Soviet activity. Nothing unusual about that. The morning briefing was held in one of those temporary plywood huts we called offices. It smelled like coffee and dust, and the projector kept flickering while the captain went over the satellite images. One large cave mouth, several smaller openings along the cliff, a few Soviet-era fortifications nearby. I remember the map more clearly than his voice, maybe because something about that location felt older, heavier, like it didn't belong to any modern war. When the meeting ended, our interpreter, Azizullah, lingered by the door. He was a quiet man in his 50s who'd been with our unit for months, never talked much, never joked, just did his job. That morning, though, he looked uneasy. As I gathered my notes, he said quietly, "This is a bad place, Sergeant. Local people, they don't go there." Not even during the day I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head. Old stories. From before Islam came. Things lived there that shouldn't be disturbed. I'd heard plenty of ghost stories out here. Jinns, curses, mountain spirits. But superstition had no place in an operation. Every cave in this country's got stories, I told him. Doesn't change our orders. He didn't argue, just looked at me like a man watching someone step into a storm they didn't see coming. We rolled out of Bagram Airfield at 0800 hours in 2 armored Humvees. My team of 8 was solid. Specialist Halifax, our medic from Oregon, 2 riflemen, a grenadier, a machine gunner with the SAW, our comms specialist, an EOD engineer, and Azizullah riding shotgun beside me. The route took us through a few scattered villages, kids waving, elders watching, the same mix of curiosity and distrust I'd come to recognize. After 90 minutes, the dirt track narrowed into a broken trail winding toward the foothills. The further we climbed, the quieter it got, until the only sounds were tires crunching gravel and the wind slipping through the rocks. The cave system was carved into the side of a limestone ridge about 400 meters up from the valley floor. From a distance, the entrance looked like a black wound cut into the mountain. We parked below and hiked the rest of the way, setting up a small perimeter among the boulders that gave us a clear view of the mouth. I scanned the terrain through binoculars. No fresh tracks, no heat signatures, just old Soviet concrete barriers and the rusted bones of cables leading into darkness. The satellite feed hadn't done it justice. The entrance was massive, big enough for a truck to drive through. The others moved quietly, checking arcs and sectors. Halifax crouched near the rocks, running his fingers over something carved into the stone. "These markings look old," he said. "Not Soviet old, ancient." I glanced at them. Weathered symbols, half-worn by centuries of wind. Azizullah was right beside him, eyes fixed on the same stones. "Before Soviets," he murmured. "Before Taliban. Very old." I didn't want to entertain it. but something about the pattern felt deliberate, like the stones had been placed as a warning, or a boundary. I forced the thought aside and got back to business. Standard formation inside, I ordered. Weapons hot, NVGs ready. Halifax, you stay close. We find any stockpiles, we mark, log, and call EOD. Everyone nodded. We moved out across 200 meters of open ground toward the entrance. That's when things started feeling wrong. The air temperature dropped sharply, maybe 10 degrees in less than a minute, and a foul smell drifted out of the cave, like sulfur and rot mixed with something sweetly decayed. The engineer muttered, "Could be gas seepage. These limestone caves do that." But Azizullah just whispered, "This is the smell before they come." I didn't know what he meant, but the look in his eyes made the air feel colder. At 25 meters out, I halted the team to check equipment. The comms specialist tapped his headset, frowning. "Sir, I'm getting static." Started when we got close. Halifax checked his med kit and frowned at the thermometer's readings, numbers flickering between freezing and boiling. Even the NVG started glitching, showing strange heat signatures that didn't match any shape we could see. "Could be magnetic interference," I said, though my voice sounded more like reassurance than belief. "Lots of metal, old wiring. Stay sharp." We entered the cave at 10:30 hours. The tunnel swallowed light almost instantly. My boots echoed off damp stone, and the beam from my flashlight stretched only a few meters before dissolving into black. Concrete reinforcements marked Soviet work, walls, supports, old cable lines. But beneath that, the mountain still showed its age. Raw limestone veins, dark crevices, carvings whose language no one recognized. The first chamber opened up about 30 meters in. Soviet ammo boxes lined the walls, most of them empty, but disturbed recently. Someone, or something, had been there before us. I crouched to inspect a half-buried crate and found ash mixed with fragments of bone. Human? Hard to say. As we advanced deeper, the air grew colder, heavy enough that breathing felt like dragging ice through your chest. The smell intensified, a mix of burnt metal and decay, and an odd metallic taste coated my tongue. The deeper we went, the worse our equipment behaved. Radios were useless, just static, and compasses spun like they'd lost all sense of north. My NVG battery died outright, even though I'd replaced it the night before. Halifax muttered, "Sir, this isn't just interference." "Something's off the charts," I told him to keep moving, even though I could feel the unease crawling under my skin too. Then we found the prints, in a stretch of soft dust near the next chamber. Massive footprints, 18 inches long, clawed toes, spaced for something walking upright. "Bear?" one rifleman offered, but his voice cracked halfway through. The weight pressed into those prints said otherwise. I traced one with my glove. Edges sharp, undisturbed, fresh. Whatever made them had been here recently. We followed the tracks into a wider cavern where the walls pulsed with echoes of time. Carvings grew more detailed, ritual shapes, symbols of figures bowing before giants. Halifax whispered, "Some of this could be Buddhist era. Maybe older." He didn't need to say it, but the images didn't look like anything peaceful. Fire pits ringed the center of the chamber, surrounded by bones bleached white. Some too small to belong to soldiers. I didn't say a word. That was when Azizullah broke. His voice trembled, barely a whisper. "We need to go, Sergeant. This is the place of the development. The old stories are true." I opened my mouth to calm him, but that's when I heard it too. A deep, rolling vibration that came from somewhere ahead in the tunnels. Not machinery, not echoes. It sounded alive. The sound came again, deeper this time, rolling through the tunnels like thunder trapped in stone. It wasn't just noise. It carried weight, pressure, a vibration I could feel in my ribs. My team froze instantly, eyes darting between me and the black mouth of the passage ahead. "Everyone hold position," I whispered. "Weapons ready. Halifax, stay with Azizullah. No one fires unless I give the order." The air had gone still, heavy, cold enough that our breath came out in faint plumes even with our flashlights still cutting through the dark. The second sound came closer, unmistakably the rhythm of footsteps, slow, deliberate, too heavy to be human. I felt every instinct scream retreat, but training held me in place. The beam of my light trembled slightly as I pointed it down the tunnel. Shadows rippled across the walls, and then I saw movement, something enormous shifting just beyond the reach of the light. When it finally stepped forward, my brain refused to process what I was looking at. The figure that emerged from the darkness was roughly humanoid but stretched, built on an impossible scale. 12 feet tall at least, shoulders like stone blocks, its skin the color of burned clay. 2 horns curved from its skull like those of a ram, thick and ridged. Patches of coarse black hair clung to its arms and torso, and when it inhaled, the sound filled the chamber like a bellows. The stench of sulfur and rot hit us in a wave. I had seen a lot of things that didn't make sense in war. Things explosions do to the human body, things nightmares make of memory. But this wasn't fear, this was paralysis. It moved closer, light from our flashlights crawling up its chest, revealing scars carved into its flesh. Patterns, symbols, deliberate as ritual markings. Its eyes caught the light like amber, glowing faintly, intelligent and ancient. I don't know what I expected. An attack maybe, a roar. But instead it spoke. Its voice was so deep I felt it in my bones before I heard it in my ears. "Who disturbs the old places?" it said, each word vibrating through the air. "Who brings iron and fire into the sacred caves?" For a moment no one moved. Even the hum of our gear seemed to die. Halifax later told me he felt like time had stopped, like the air itself had thickened. I wanted to say something, anything, but my throat locked. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded strange to me. Small, human. "We're U.S. forces. This area is under investigation for weapon storage." The thing tilted its head, studying us. Its mouth opened, revealing 2 rows of teeth, curved, yellow, like tusks more than human molars. It made a noise that might have been laughter, but it came out like metal grinding. "Weapons?" it said mockingly, glancing toward the stacks of old Soviet rifles along the wall. "These trinkets are offerings, left by those who still remember." I didn't understand. "Offerings to who?" I asked. "To us," it said simply. "To the dev, the old ones who guard what remains beneath your wars." Its tone wasn't rage. It was weariness, like something too ancient to care about men with guns. Still, my grip on my rifle tightened until my knuckles ached. The thing stepped closer, and the temperature plunged again. Frost began to spread across the rocks, creeping in veins from where it stood. I heard one of the riflemen whisper a prayer under his breath. Azizula was shaking uncontrollably, eyes wide, whispering, "Dev, Dev," over and over. The creature's gaze drifted to him. "You know us," it said in that impossible, resonant voice. "Your ancestors made fire in these halls. They fed us blood and bone when the mountains still burned." I felt my stomach twist. "What do you want from us?" I asked. The thing's eyes shifted back to me. "What do I want?" It almost smiled, a grotesque motion that split its face like a crack in rock. "I want you to leave this place and never return. I want your people to stop cutting open the earth for your little wars. I want the mountains to sleep again." Then, as if the world had forgotten gravity, it reached out one arm and grabbed an ammunition box from the floor, a full steel crate, easily 50 pounds, and crushed it in its palm like it was tin foil. The sound of metal shrieking filled the chamber, echoing through the tunnels. "Sir," Halifax whispered, "we can't fight that." He was right. I'd fought men, insurgents, ambushes, but this wasn't any of that. My training had no line in the manual for creatures that spoke English in the dark. I made the only call that made sense. "Team," I said quietly, "we're pulling out. Maintain formation. Backtrack to entrance. Do not fire unless directly engaged." I turned slowly, never dropping my rifle. The others followed, stepping carefully, flashlights shaking. The creature watched us, unmoving. Then as we began to retreat, it spoke again. "You are wise to leave," it said. "Tell your commanders that some caches are not meant to be disturbed. Your weapons cannot harm what is older than your kind." We began the withdrawal, every second stretching thin as wire. It didn't pursue, not at first. It just followed, 20 meters behind, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that didn't match its size. The sound of its footsteps filled the cave, steady and patient, like it was herding us out rather than chasing us. At one point, Halifax stumbled, and his light flickered across the carvings on the wall, rows of human figures kneeling before giants. blood streaming down to a black pit carved in the rock. I saw it too, and for a moment, I wondered if those carvings were memories. By the time we reached the first chamber, I could feel warmth returning to the air. My radio sputtered back to life. Static, then fragments of words from our overwatch. Bravo 6 Alpha, do you copy? I grabbed the mic. Bravo 6 Alpha here. No immediate threat, but sight requires follow-up. Over, my voice sounded calm, but my hand was trembling so hard I had to steady it against the wall. The creature stopped at the threshold of the deeper tunnel, just watching us. Its outline filled the entire passage, backlit by the pale glow of our flashlights. It didn't move closer, just stood there as if bound to that place. When we finally stepped into sunlight again, the warmth hit like a shock. Radios cleared, thermometers normalized, and the smell disappeared completely. Behind us, the cave mouth gaped open, black and silent. I looked back one last time, and that's when I saw it. A silhouette framed in the darkness, horns barely visible, motionless, watching. The team climbed into the Humvees without a word. No one spoke the entire drive back. At base, the debrief was quick but uncomfortable. The intelligence officers listened to my report without looking me in the eye. They wanted to know about the weapons, the markings, the psychological factors. When I mentioned the entity, they exchanged glances but didn't interrupt. Finally, one of them said, "We'll classify this as environmental and cultural anomalies. Focus on the tangible findings." I didn't argue. I wrote the report clean: environmental interference, electromagnetic disruption, unknown atmospheric cause. The truth didn't fit in their boxes. Later, Halifax found me sitting outside the barracks, staring toward the dark line of the mountains. "You think it was real?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. The night was too quiet, the stars too still. "It doesn't matter," I said finally. "Real or not, it was there." A few days after the debrief, command reassigned me to a security rotation outside Bagram. Officially, it was routine personnel adjustment, but everyone knew it was a quiet way of bearing something they didn't want questioned. The report I filed went up the chain and vanished into that place where inconvenient stories go. They never mentioned the cave again. Halifax was transferred to a medical support unit in Jalalabad, and Azizullah disappeared altogether. Someone said he'd resigned and gone back to his village in the Panjshir Valley. I didn't blame him. What we saw in that cave wasn't supposed to exist, and yet it did. For weeks afterward, I kept seeing flashes of it whenever the lights flickered or the generators coughed. That impossible figure standing in the dark, voice echoing through my skull. There are places in this world that belong to older powers. At night, the temperature in my quarters sometimes dropped without reason, and the radio would hum faintly even when switched off. I told myself it was power fluctuation, interference, nerves, but deep down I knew the mountain wasn't finished with me. 3 weeks after the operation, another team was dispatched to that same grid. I heard about it from one of the intel techs during breakfast. They'd gone to confirm our findings and recover the cache. Only when they arrived, the cave entrance was gone, sealed by a rockfall. No signs of detonation, no seismic activity recorded, just hundreds of tons of limestone collapsed across the mouth. The tech showed me a satellite image, where our vehicles had once parked. Nothing but rubble now. The official statement called it natural instability. I knew better. The dev, or whatever it was, had made sure no one came back. Rumors started circulating around Bagram. Stories of other teams hearing strange sounds in cave systems farther east. Equipment failures, voices in languages no one spoke. A few called them stress hallucinations, the usual ghost soldiers drag with them. But I began to notice a pattern. Every one of those incidents happened in caves with long religious histories. Buddhist monasteries, old Zoroastrian temples, places marked on maps centuries before ours existed. It was as if something beneath those mountains had started waking up again. I kept notes in a small green logbook, entries I never turned in, reports of static, temperature drops, patterns carved into stone. I wasn't the only one keeping records. Halifax wrote to me from Jalalabad weeks later. He said he still dreamed of the cave, the cold air, the smell, the voice speaking English too clearly. Maybe it wanted to be understood, he wrote. Maybe that's worse. In January 2005, an internal intelligence memo circulated quietly among field officers. I managed to glimpse it during a briefing, a declassified draft later buried under psychological factors. It said insurgent groups were utilizing cave systems for ritual or symbolic purposes potentially related to local belief structures. They called it a morale tactic, a way to unnerve coalition forces through superstition. But I'd seen the look on that thing's face. It didn't care about tactics. It existed outside our definitions. Later that month, Dr. Robert Kellner, a cultural advisor out of Kabul, gave a seminar on cultural anomalies in conflict zones. He said Afghan folklore spoke of beings called divs, giants or demons that lived in the mountains, older than Islam, older even than fire. They were said to guard hidden treasures and punish those who disturb sacred ground. Listening to him, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The description matched everything we'd seen. Military psychologists offered other explanations: combat fatigue, shared hallucination, group suggestion amplified by environmental stress. Dr. Starkey from the behavioral unit said it was a convergence of belief and sensory distortion. Maybe he was right about most cases, but not ours. 8 soldiers saw the same thing, heard the same words, felt the same cold. Hallucinations don't break radios or crush steel boxes with bare hands. When I brought that up, the doctor smiled politely and changed the subject. The official narrative was already written. Environmental interference, psychological stress. Easier to file under science than superstition. Months later, fragments of our mission began surfacing in Freedom of Information releases. Heavily redacted, entire pages blacked out. One section mentioned unexplained electromagnetic anomalies and recommended cultural sensitivity briefings for all units entering historical sites. Another line read, personnel should be advised of unconventional intimidation tactics used by local combatants in myth-associated areas. It was their way of admitting something they couldn't name. During that time, I began hearing about Staff Sergeant Martinez from military intelligence. She'd logged 24 similar reports from eastern Afghanistan, caves that interfered with electronics, soldiers hearing whispers in the dark, heat signatures with no bodies attached. Every time the pattern repeated, ancient religious site, unexplained phenomena, sealed or abandoned afterward. I sometimes wondered if that thing in the cave had spoken to others, if other teams had walked into other mouths of the mountain and come back changed. The difference was that we'd listened to the warning. Leave this place and never return. Some didn't. By late 2005, the number of reported cave operations dropped sharply. Orders shifted focus toward building trust with local communities instead of clearing out hidden caches. It looked like a tactical shift on paper, but those of us who'd seen the inside of the mountain knew better. Someone up top had decided that certain doors were better left closed. Back home, I couldn't shake it. Civilian life felt hollow, sterile, as if everything around me lacked weight compared to that darkness. The smell of diesel or the sound of wind through vents could still pull me back there in an instant. I'd wake some nights convinced I heard that same deep voice under the static of the radio I kept by my bed. When I finally tracked down Halifax years later, in 2019, he sounded tired but steady. We talked for hours. People can believe what they want, he told me. I know what I saw. Call it a div, a demon, whatever. It was real, I agreed, though the word real felt too small for what we'd faced. There's a lesson buried in those mountains, something older than every uniform and flag. We went in thinking power was measured in rifles and airstrikes. But there are places in this world where power doesn't care about our definitions. It sleeps beneath the earth, patient until someone knocks too loud. And when it answers, it doesn't need to shout to make itself understood. Even now, when I think back to that day, I see the cave mouth framed against the snow, the darkness breathing just beyond sight. And I remember the last words it spoke to us, words burned so deep they echo through every quiet room I sit in. Tell your commanders that some caches are not meant to be disturbed. I did. They didn't listen. But maybe, somewhere in those sealed tunnels, the mountain remembers for all of us. Time passed, but the story refused to die. Even when the official channels closed it off, the whispers kept moving through the ranks. Soldiers swapped stories at outposts, over bad coffee and cigarette smoke, about the caves that ate signals, the tunnels where light bent the wrong way, the footsteps that followed long after a patrol had ended. Some swore they'd seen shapes watching from ridges. Others heard chanting in languages no translator could recognize. I learned to keep quiet when the subject came up. You could see who believed and who didn't by how long they held your gaze. By then, I'd stopped trying to convince anyone. The truth didn't need believers, it just waited, same as the mountain. I was called in twice more for clarification interviews with intelligence officers, both times in those dim offices that smelled of dust and metal. They asked the same questions over and over. What was the creature's physical composition? What language did it use? What environmental conditions preceded its appearance? I gave the same answers, but it never seemed to satisfy them. Finally, one of them, a major, asked if I thought the thing could have been human. I just stared at him for a long time before saying, "If it was, it's the oldest kind I've ever seen." That was the last time anyone brought it up officially. Still, fragments of the truth kept surfacing. Someone leaked that the CIA had cross-referenced our coordinates with historical cartography and found records of Buddhist cave networks dating back to the 2nd century. A few archaeologists suggested those same sites had once been Zoroastrian shrines before being converted. It made sense. Afghanistan had always been a place where religions layered over each other like sediment, each leaving behind a trace of something older. The Dev, according to scholars, weren't just demons as modern folklore painted them. In the Avestan texts, they were devas, spirits of chaos, yes, but once divine. Beings that had fallen not because they were evil, but because they opposed order as defined by man and God alike. To think of it that way, to imagine we'd stumbled into a shrine not abandoned, but guarded, made the memory even heavier. We hadn't been soldiers investigating a cache. We'd been trespassers. One night in 2006, while stationed briefly in Kandahar for a security rotation, I ran into an anthropologist working with NATO's Cultural Advisory Division, Dr. Robert Kellner. I'd read his name in one of the internal reports months before. Over warm tea in a tent lit by battery lamps, he told me something that stuck with me. "You can't separate myth from warfare in this region," he said. "Every hill, every ruin, every cave, someone believes something lives there. You don't fight people here. You fight their memories." I asked him if he believed the stories. He smiled faintly, tiredly. "Belief doesn't matter," he said. "If something shapes reality for enough centuries, it becomes real enough." He mentioned how insurgent groups sometimes perform rituals before ambushes, invoking protection from ancient spirits. "For them," he said, "the mountain is alive." I didn't tell him that I'd met it myself. In late 2006, an internal memorandum from the Defense Intelligence Agency circulated under the title Unconventional Environmental Phenomena, Eastern Theater. It referenced unexplained interference patterns and localized electromagnetic distortion events. The classified portion, according to someone I trusted, included field accounts from at least a dozen other units. None as extreme as ours, but eerily similar. Equipment failing near cave networks, sudden temperature drops, animal behavior anomalies, even psychological effects among personnel. The report's recommendation was simple: avoid deep cave incursions in regions marked by persistent anomalous readings. Utilize local advisors to assess potential cultural significance. That was bureaucratic language for stay away. But the part that haunted me most came years later, when I read a translated excerpt from an Iranian historical manuscript about the Div of the Northern Mountains. It said the Div were guardians of balance, bound to the earth itself, awakened only when sacred boundaries were violated. They didn't seek war, they enforced silence. It reminded me of what the creature had said in the cave, that our kind made war on everything that moved, and that we would one day choke on the noise. Maybe it wasn't a threat, maybe it was prophecy. Looking back, I've realized something about the way the mountain worked. It didn't just test our courage, it measured our arrogance. Every army that had ever passed through those valleys thought it could master the land. Alexander, Genghis Khan, the British, the Soviets, and then us. The mountain outlasted them all. We thought we were uncovering the remnants of old wars, but maybe we were just adding new layers to an older story that began long before us. There's a saying among the locals, the mountain remembers who listens and who takes. That's why, I think, we walked out alive. We listened. When the incident was quietly archived, some in intelligence dismissed it as a myth-making reflex, the human need to find meaning in chaos. Maybe they were right. But when I heard about the second team finding that cave sealed tight, like it had never existed, I knew something had answered us. You don't need faith to recognize consequence. The mountain wasn't hiding anything. It was protecting it. The weapons we saw, arranged like offerings, weren't left by the enemy. They were tributes. Bargains made by men who'd learned the old ways still had power. By 2007, the higher commands shifted operational doctrine. Cultural interference sensitivity became the new buzzword. Caves once flagged as strategic sites were marked as restricted. Officially, it was to preserve heritage landmarks, but everyone on the ground knew it meant something else. We'd awakened something, and the brass didn't want to risk it again. Operations in the eastern mountains dropped sharply, replaced by community outreach and ground stabilization missions. It looked like progress on paper, but to me it felt like retreat. After my discharge, I started reading everything I could about ancient Persian demonology, old Afghan folklore, Zoroastrian cosmology. Most of it was contradictory, stories passed down through centuries, rewritten by conquerors and believers alike. But one theme stayed constant. The div dwell where the world is thinnest, where the human and the primordial overlap. Caves, mountains, ruins, the breathing places of the earth. They are not evil, only indifferent, ancient custodians of places that should remain untouched. And for all our technology, our satellites, and our weapons, we are still the trespassers at the door. Sometimes I wonder if the mountain marked me that day. There are nights I wake with the echo of that voice still rolling in my head. Slow, patient, almost mournful. Your wars are small things. He was right. Everything since has felt small. The world has grown louder, faster, more hollow, as if the further we go, the more we forget that silence can still have a heartbeat. Maybe that's why I'm telling this story now, not to convince anyone, but to leave a record. So that if someone finds that ridge again someday, when the rocks shift and the cave reopens, they'll remember what was said inside. Leave it be. Let the old powers sleep. Over time, the story of what happened in that cave became part of a larger pattern, one buried deep within Afghanistan's history and folklore. I began to realize that what we'd encountered wasn't an isolated event. It fit into something older, something woven into the DNA of the land itself. The ancient Persians believed the div were not just monsters, but fallen guardians, creatures that once walked alongside gods before being condemned to shadow. When I started studying the old texts, I found the same traits repeating across centuries: towering size, immense strength, eyes that glowed like embers, a voice that could shake stone. They were said to be bound to mountains and caves, to places untouched by sunlight, and could manipulate the natural world around them. The more I read, the clearer it became that the thing in that cave matched those descriptions perfectly, right down to the way the air froze and the smell of sulfur filled the air before it appeared. Dr. Ahmad Samadi, a Persian literature professor I contacted years later, told me the same thing. The div, he said, are not metaphors. They are remnants, guardians left behind when men stopped believing in balance. He explained how over thousands of years, these beings changed shape and stories. In early Zoroastrianism, they were divine entities representing chaos and nature's raw power. When monotheistic faith took hold, the div were recast as demons, symbols of corruption and disorder. But even then, the belief never disappeared. In remote regions of Afghanistan and Iran, people still left offerings near mountain shrines and sealed caves, whispering prayers to keep the old spirits asleep. What struck me most was how consistent those traditions remained, even after centuries of conquest and conversion. Every empire that entered these mountains, from the Greeks to the British to the Soviets, brought their gods and their science, but the locals never stopped honoring what was already here. That's why, when Azizullah told me before the mission, things live there that should not be disturbed, I should have listened. He wasn't warning me out of superstition. He was repeating knowledge passed down through generations of survival. Modern military intelligence never understood that. They saw religion, folklore, and myth as tools for psychological warfare. They never considered that some of it might have roots in truth. After our encounter, reports of environmental anomalies continued to surface. Small units claiming to hear inhuman sounds in sealed tunnels, soldiers describing sudden power drops, followed by whispers or vibrations in the rock. None of those stories reached the public, of course. They were classified as stress-induced reactions or electromagnetic interference. But those of us who'd been inside the mountain knew the pattern. Temperature collapse, static, the smell of sulfur, and that heavy stillness right before something steps out of the dark. It was never about belief, it was about respect. You can only disturb ancient ground for so long before it reminds you who owns it. I sometimes think about the Soviets who fought here decades before us, digging into the same mountains, building bunkers, tunneling through sacred sites. I wonder how many of them saw what we did, and how many never came back to tell it. The Persians once said the divs slept in the deepest hollows of the world, and only men's arrogance could wake them. Maybe we've been waking them for centuries without realizing it. Machines, bombs, drills, and greed. It's all the same noise to something that listens from beneath the earth. Dr. Samadhi told me something that still haunts me. The div were said to mirror men. The more violent humanity becomes, the stronger they grow. If that's true, maybe the creature in that cave wasn't just a guardian. It was a reflection, a living echo of our own destruction. It warned us, not out of mercy, but because it didn't want to be provoked again. Maybe the mountain itself had spoken through it, tired of being carved open by another empire pretending to bring order. Even now I can hear its words like a pulse beneath silence. You bring iron and fire to sacred places. That voice didn't belong to mythology. It belonged to something ancient enough to remember the first war humanity ever started against the world itself. And if it still waits there, behind that sealed rock, then it isn't sleeping. It's watching. Watching to see if we've learned anything from the ruins we keep making. I doubt we have. In the months and years that followed, what happened in that cave became more than a story. It became evidence that wouldn't die quietly. Even though official reports buried it under environmental anomalies and psychological strain, new fragments kept surfacing through channels never meant for public eyes. I remember seeing a declassified memo stamped from 2005, lines half blacked out. But the parts that remained were enough to tell the truth. It said insurgent groups in eastern Afghanistan were utilizing cave systems not only for tactical concealment, but also for ritual purposes linked to pre-Islamic folklore. They were offering weapons, the same way we'd seen in that chamber, as if trying to strike bargains with forces that didn't belong in this century. The brass labeled it psychological warfare tactics, but I could read between the lines. They'd seen what we saw. Maybe not as close, maybe not as clear, but enough to understand that something ancient was being disturbed. Around that time, I came across the name of Staff Sergeant Jennifer Martinez, who'd served in military intelligence at Bagram during the same period. She reported over 24 separate incidents across 18 months, soldiers describing equipment failure, voices in the dark, heat signatures that vanished when approached. I reached out years later, after discharge, just to know if I wasn't losing my mind. Her reply was short, careful. We had patterns, caves with old religious history. The deeper they went, the stranger it got. That one sentence said more than any report. Even intelligence couldn't explain it. They could only document it. The language they used grew colder and more clinical with every draft. Unverified sensory phenomena, mass suggestion, localized temperature inversion. But none of that hid the truth. Something in those caves didn't want us there. The deeper I dug, the more the pattern emerged. Always the same sequence. Ancient site, unnatural interference. Soldiers reporting sensations of pressure or presence, then silence. Most of those places were later sealed under stability operations, which meant dynamited or filled with debris. Command claimed it was to prevent insurgent use, but we knew better. Those sites weren't closed for tactical reasons. They were quarantined. The mountains had become a living archive of warnings carved in stone, and someone high up decided it was safer to erase the evidence than to face it. I once overheard a civilian contractor from the Defense Intelligence Service say, "If half those field accounts are real, we're not running a war. We're trespassing on a graveyard." It wasn't just soldiers either. Local villagers refused to guide patrols into certain valleys even for money. They'd say, "The old powers sleep there," and cross themselves regardless of faith. Some elders still left offerings, stones stacked in circles, blood from goats spilled quietly before dawn. It wasn't religion, it was survival. They'd learned to live beside things they didn't control, while we came with our technology and arrogance, thinking we could own everything we saw on a satellite map. We never realized the land itself might have rules older than war. By 2006, official policy changed. Caves and ancient sites were labeled culturally restricted zones. The paperwork called it preservation, but the soldiers on the ground called it ghost lockdown. You didn't ask why, you just stayed away. The number of reported anomalies dropped sharply after that. Either the mountain grew quiet, or we finally stopped listening long enough to provoke it. Part of me likes to think it went back to sleep, satisfied that we'd learned. Another part knows better. Years later, I spoke with Dr. Kellner again, the same anthropologist who'd once told me that belief could shape reality. He said something that stuck with me. In asymmetric wars, the supernatural becomes a weapon, sometimes psychological, sometimes literal. When you invade a culture's sacred ground, the reaction won't always be human. His words echoed the same warning the dev gave me years before, that our wars were small compared to what we were waking beneath them. I told him about the creature's voice, how it spoke English like it had been waiting centuries to be understood. He didn't laugh. He just nodded and said, "Maybe it learned your language long before you arrived." I've seen combat, I've seen death, but nothing ever unsettled me like that idea, that something ancient, patient, and intelligent had been watching humanity's violence through millennia, adapting to each invader, learning our tongues, our weapons, our mistakes. When I think about it now, I wonder how many soldiers vanished into those mountains, written off as MIA, when in truth they'd crossed a line between history and myth. The government can classify all the reports at once, but truth has a way of surviving. Every soldier who's walked through those caves carries a piece of it, even if they never speak. You can see it in their eyes. The same awareness I've seen in Halifax when we meet every few years. The same silence when we talk about that day. We don't use words like monster or demon. We just say it, and that's enough. What I've learned is simple. There are places on this planet that don't belong to us. They never did. We call them myth because that's easier than admitting how small we really are. The mountains of Afghanistan are older than any empire, any faith, any war, and some of what sleeps inside them remembers when the first human words were spoken in fear. I used to think the creature we met was a nightmare that ended when we left the cave. Now I understand, it was a warning, the kind the world gives once, then never repeats. Even after all these years, the memory of that day in the cave still feels closer than anything else I've lived through. Time hasn't dulled it. It's like the air from that place followed me home, heavy and cold, a shadow that knows how to wait. When people ask me about Afghanistan, I never talk about firefights or ambushes. I talk about silence, the kind that hums, that breathes, that listens back. Because what we met in that mountain wasn't just a creature, it was history made flesh. Something older than our flags, older than the first war, standing in front of us and reminding us that we've never really been in control. I've come to understand that the mountain doesn't need to move to make itself known. It just waits for us to dig too deep. When I left the service, I thought distance would bury it. Civilian life was supposed to feel normal again, steady, quiet, predictable. But normal never came. Sometimes when I drive at night, the static on the radio will crackle for a moment, just enough to make me remember that voice. It didn't shout, didn't threaten. It spoke like something that didn't need to prove it existed. I keep thinking about what it said before we left. Your wars are small things. Back then I took it as arrogance. Now I think it was pity. Maybe it wasn't warning us out of anger, but disappointment. Because no matter how much we claim to build, all we ever do is destroy. I've been interviewed by writers, researchers, even filmmakers who wanted to turn the story into something sensational. They all asked the same question. Do you believe it was real? I always answer the same way. I believe what I saw. Whether it came from folklore or physics doesn't matter. It was real in the way fear is real, in the way the earth is real under your boots. Richards's team, Halifax, Azazula, we all carried the same image out of that darkness, and not one of us ever contradicted the other. That kind of consistency doesn't come from hysteria. It comes from truth. And truth out here doesn't care about belief. There's a pattern I've noticed since then. Every place that's seen too much war carries its own kind of haunting. The Hindu Kush, the Carpathians, the jungles of Vietnam, everywhere that's been scarred by conflict, you'll find stories about something ancient watching from the edges. Maybe those stories survive because they're not entirely stories. Maybe they're warnings written in myth to keep us from repeating the same mistakes. But humans never listen. We dig, we burn, we claim, we forget. The mountain doesn't forget, it waits. Sometimes I dream about the cave, always the same way. I'm walking toward it again, the air thick with frost, the light fading as I get closer. But when I reach the entrance, there's no sound, no movement, just the dark. And from somewhere deep inside, I hear a low voice, calm and patient, saying, "Some things should be left alone." I wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, radio hissing faintly like it's remembering too. Those are the nights I don't sleep again until dawn. I've spoken with Halifax a few times since. He moved to the coast. Quiet life. No press, no interviews. He told me he still hears the hum sometimes when he closes his eyes, like a vibration under the skin. It wasn't a nightmare, he said. It was a reminder. I knew exactly what he meant. For men like us, war used to be about survival, about the enemy in front of you. But after that cave, the enemy didn't wear a face. It was the arrogance inside us, the belief that nothing was older or greater than our own strength. That's what the dev broke, the illusion that we understood the world we fought over. As for Azizullah, the interpreter, he went back to his village in Panjshir Valley. I heard he became a sort of elder, warning others not to enter certain caves, telling children that some places still belong to the old powers. When journalists tried to interview him, he refused. One villager told me, "He says the Americans are brave but foolish. They wake things better left dreaming. I can't say he's wrong." The cave where it happened is still sealed by rockfall. Satellite images show it untouched. No movement, no reopening. The locals avoid it completely. They say it hums sometimes during storms. Whether that's the wind or something deeper, I don't want to know. Part of me hopes it stays buried forever. Another part wonders what would happen if someone ever dug it open again. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. People ask why I tell this story at all. The truth is, I'm not trying to convince anyone. I just want to leave something behind, a record, so that when the mountain wakes again, someone will remember we were warned. Because the thing about legends is, they only sound like fiction until they start breathing. The mountains of the Hindu Kush have seen every kind of empire come and go. They've watched flags rise and rot, languages fade, gods replaced. Yet through it all, the stones have kept their silence, and whatever lives beneath them has endured. Maybe that's what immortality really looks like. Not life forever, but memory that refuses to die. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. The world isn't ours. We just walk on its surface pretending we're in charge. But beneath our feet, under the dust and bones and ruins, older powers are still waiting. The mountains remember, and sometimes if you listen closely enough, they remind you that some echoes never fade. And that's it, soldiers. Another secret buried deep in the mountains. Maybe it was myth. Maybe it was something real that just didn't want to be found. Either way, I'm not going back to check. If you enjoyed this dive into the unknown, smash that like button, drop your theories in the comments. And if you think you're brave enough for the next one, hit subscribe and join the Captain Rebel crew. Because out here, legends don't die. They just wait to be told.